"Sir, this section is reserved for first-class passengers." The words cut through the cabin before he even had time to settle in. The young black pilot, still in his crisp uniform, looked up from his seat. His eyes met the stern gaze of the flight attendant standing over him. Around them, passengers fell silent. A few shifted in their leather seats, suddenly alert, sensing something was about to unfold. He answered calmly, his voice steady but firm. "I know. That's why I'm here." But the attendant didn't back away. She tilted her head, her lips curling into a thin, dismissive smile. "I just need to be sure," she pressed, her tone sweet enough for appearances, but sharp enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We've had people sneak into this cabin before. It happens more often than you'd think." The implication stung. His jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. He had heard this before, this quiet disbelief that someone like him could belong here. Passengers nearby exchanged glances. A businessman leaned back, pretending to read his paper while listening closely. A young woman froze mid-sip of her drink, her eyes locked on the scene. The tension was thick now, stretching with every pause. He leaned forward slightly, his voice even lower, firmer. "This is my seat." She gave a short laugh, almost mocking. "Really? Because I've just never seen—" She stopped, letting the silence speak louder than the words she wouldn't say. "Someone like you, sitting here before." The pause was deliberate. Everyone caught it. The meaning was clear. Heat burned in his chest, but he didn't move. He stayed seated, back straight, uniform pristine, refusing to let her condescension rattle him. He had trained for years, flown through storms and turbulence far worse than this moment. But humiliation in front of strangers, that was its own kind of storm. The flight attendant scribbled something on her notepad, muttering, "We'll see about that," before clicking away down the aisle. Her heels struck the floor like gavel blows, final, damning. Whispers spread instantly. The cabin had become a stage. Some passengers avoided his eyes, too uncomfortable to acknowledge what they'd just witnessed. Others glanced openly, curiosity etched across their faces. The silence after her departure was louder than the engines humming beneath their feet. He adjusted his seatbelt, trying to steady his breath. He reminded himself, "Stay calm, stay professional, don't let this break you." But inside the words replayed, echoing with the weight of every time he had been doubted, questioned, or dismissed. This wasn't new, but each time it cut deeper. And as he stared down the aisle where the attendant had vanished, a thought tightened in his chest. This wasn't over. Because now, she was coming back. The cabin air felt heavier than before, as if every passenger had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. The flight attendant's sharp words still lingered, echoing in silence. Then, almost on cue, the murmurs began. A businessman in the second row leaned toward his seatmate, whispering, "Did you hear that? She doesn't think he belongs here." His companion only nodded, eyes flicking nervously toward the young black pilot, then back down to his folded newspaper. Across the aisle, a woman clutched her handbag a little tighter, not in fear, but in discomfort. She whispered to no one in particular. Why would she question him like that? The question hung unanswered, swallowed by the low hum of gossip moving like a ripple through the cabin. The pilot, sitting still in his seat, heard every word, every sigh, every whisper, every shift of fabric as passengers leaned and stared. He tightened his grip on the armrest, but kept his face calm, his uniform perfect, his posture unshaken, outwardly. I composed, inwardly burning. Then came the sound again, heels clicking down the aisle. The same flight attendant returned, her professional smile masking the storm behind her eyes. She leaned down ever so slightly, her tone quiet enough to sound polite, but clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Sir," she said, tapping her notepad, "if you'd like, I can find you a more suitable seat. Economy has plenty of space." A soft gasp escaped someone 3 rows back. The pilot's jaw clenched. His response was calm, but carried the weight of steel. "I said before, this is my seat." Her smile didn't falter, though her voice sharpened like a blade wrapped in silk. "Of course. I just wouldn't want you to feel out of place up here." The passengers froze again. No one dared to speak, but eyes darted from her to him, watching, measuring, waiting to see what he would do. For a long moment, he said nothing. He let the silence grow, until even the faint rattle of the air vents seemed louder. Then, finally, he spoke, each word precise. "I've spent my entire career proving I belong. I won't start explaining myself to you now." The attendant's expression stiffened. She straightened her back, gave a curt nod, and walked away. But her absence didn't dissolve the tension. It only thickened it. Now the whispers turned into debates. Some passengers frowned, disapproving of her behavior. "That was uncalled for," a man muttered under his breath. Others simply shrugged, unsure, unwilling to get involved. The silence between opinions was deafening. The pilot looked out the window, his reflection staring back at him. He remembered the years of struggle, the endless training, the nights studying charts while others slept. Every mile flown, every exam passed, every insult ignored. All of it had brought him here. And now, in this cabin, all it took was one voice, one assumption, to try to strip it away. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. No matter how sharp the words, no matter how public the humiliation, he would not rise to her bait. His dignity was the only upon he needed. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They circled like restless bees. A passenger finally leaned forward, speaking just loud enough for others to hear. "If he says it's his seat, it's his seat. Why can't she just let it go?" A faint ripple of agreement followed, soft nods and quiet murmurs. For the first time since the confrontation began, the pilot felt a shift, not in the flight attendant's favor, but in his. Still, the unease lingered, thick and unshakable. The flight had yet to leave the ground, but the real turbulence was already inside the cabin. And as the last of the whispers faded into uneasy silence, the door to the cockpit opened. Heavy footsteps echoed down the aisle, carrying with them the unmistakable authority of command. Someone else was about to join the scene, someone who could change everything. The whispers around him faded into the background, but inside his mind the noise only grew louder. He stared at his reflection in the oval window, yet what he saw wasn't the man sitting in first class. It was the boy he once was, dreaming of touching the sky. That dream had never come easy. He remembered the first time he told his high school teacher he wanted to be a pilot. The room had gone silent, the kind of silence that carried doubt. The teacher forced a smile and said, "That's ambitious. Maybe think of something more realistic." The words stung, not because of their meaning, but because of the tone, the quiet suggestion that boys like him didn't belong in cockpits. But he didn't let it end there. He pictured the long nights in college, poring over thick manuals while others partied. He could still hear the hum of fluorescent lights in the library, the pages smudged with ink and determination. He remembered saving every dollar from part-time jobs, washing dishes, stocking shelves, just to afford another hour of flight training. Each flight, hour was a victory, each takeoff a step closer. But with every victory came another wall. At flight school, he was often the only black student in the room. He noticed the lingering stares when he walked into classrooms, the subtle comments whispered just out of earshot, and the way instructors sometimes doubted his abilities before he even touched the controls. One memory struck hardest. His first solo flight. He had stepped into the cockpit, nerves rattling his hands, heart pounding with both fear and exhilaration. But just before he boarded, an older student smirked and said, "Careful up there. Don't crash the plane. Wouldn't want the news story to be about the first black student to ruin the school's record." He had swallowed the comment, locked it deep inside, and flown that plane with precision. When the wheels kissed the runway on landing, he knew something no insult could ever take away. He belonged in the sky. Back in the present, he shifted slightly in his seat, his knuckles tight against the armrest. The memory of triumph reminded him why he refused to be moved now. But there were more scars. He recalled job interviews where he walked in wearing his best suit, qualifications stacked higher than most. And still he caught the raised eyebrows, the surprised tones. "You've got quite a resume." As if it was unexpected, as if his achievements were out of place. He remembered the sting of rejections without explanation, watching less experienced candidates walk away with offers he knew he deserved. Every setback fueled him. Every barrier lit a fire inside that said, "Prove them wrong. Keep going." And he had. He thought of his mother, sitting at the kitchen table after long shifts, encouraging him to chase his dream no matter how high the climb. "You weren't made to stay on the ground," she told him. Those words had carried him through storms, both in the air and in life. Now, sitting in that first-class seat, under the weight of judgmental eat. Yes, those memories burned brighter. The flight attendant's subtle digs were not new wounds, they were reminders of a lifelong battle. But battles had shaped him. So when she returned again, hovering near his row as if waiting for him to crack, he looked at her with quiet strength. He said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than any protest. His presence itself was defiance. Passengers noticed. A man 2 rows back whispered, "He's not budging. Good for him." Another gave the faintest nod of approval, not everyone, but enough to shift the current of the cabin. The flight attendant's smirk faltered for a moment before she turned away again. Inside, he steadied his breath. He knew one truth. If he yielded now, it would not just be a seat he gave up, but the dignity earned from every sacrifice along the way. This wasn't simply about comfort or position. It was about everything he had endured to sit where he was today, and he would not let anyone erase that. But even as he reaffirmed his stance, he knew the moment was far from over. The confrontation was building toward something greater, and soon it wouldn't just be between him and the flight attendant. Because the sound of footsteps echoed from the cockpit again, slow, deliberate, carrying authority. The captain was about to enter the scene, and with him would come the truth. The silence shattered like glass. The flight attendant returned, but this time there was no pretense of politeness. Her voice carried through the cabin, sharper, louder, no longer just for him, but for every passenger within earshot. "Sir," she said, hands on her hips, "I've asked you nicely. You need to move to the correct seat. First class is for paying passengers, or for crew authorized to be here. Which one are you?" Gasps rippled through the rows. Some passengers turned fully in their seats now, openly watching. Others sank lower, uncomfortable, but unwilling to look away. The cabin had become a stage, and the spotlight was merciless. The pilot's voice was calm, deliberate. "I've already told you. This is my assigned seat." But she pressed harder, her tone dripping with accusation. "Really? Because I've seen this before. People pretending to be someone they're not. Wearing uniforms they didn't earn. Playing games to get special treatment." She leaned closer, her words striking like blows. "So tell me, are you pretending to be a pilot?" A stunned hush fell. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. The man's hands gripped the armrest. He could feel every eye on him, judging, questioning, but his face remained composed, his voice steady as steel. "I don't pretend. I worked for everything I've achieved, and I won't let you question that." The attendant scoffed, shaking her head as if she had caught him in some grand lie. "Then prove it. Show me your boarding pass. Show me your ID. Otherwise I'll have no choice but to move you back where you belong." Passengers stirred now, whispers swirling like a current. "Is she serious?" one man muttered. "She can't talk to him like that," another whispered. But a few frowned, uncertain, suspicion creeping into their eyes. The cabin divided. Some leaned forward in sympathy, others leaned back in doubt. Every face became part of the silent jury, waiting for the verdict. The pilot pulled his boarding pass from his pocket, holding it steady in her line of sight. "Here, first class, seat assigned, no mistake." But she didn't even look closely. She snapped her notepad shut and raised her voice louder still. "I'll be verifying this with the captain, because until then, I'm not convinced you belong here." That single word, belong, echoed like thunder. The pilot's chest tightened, but he didn't rise. He stayed rooted in place, shoulders squared, eyes unflinching. Every second of restraint was a battle, but one he refused to lose. Around him the cabin buzzed with tension. A mother whispered to her child to stay quiet. A young man pulled out his phone, recording the exchange. The atmosphere was no longer just tense. It was electric, charged with conflict that could ignite at any second. The attendant straightened, her chin lifted, convinced she had the upper hand. Her voice carried down the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the disturbance. We'll get this sorted out before takeoff." Her words painted him as the problem. Her tone declared him guilty before any truth could surface. The pilot closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. He thought of every struggle, every insult, every barrier he had overcome to wear the uniform on his chest. He had faced storms fiercer than this, storms of doubt, storms of prejudice, storms that tried to ground him forever. But he had risen above each one, and he would rise above this too. When he opened his eyes again, the whispers hadn't stopped. Some passengers glared at the attendant, others at him. But all of them were waiting for someone with real authority to step forward. And then it happened. The cockpit door opened with a soft hiss. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed down the aisle. A figure emerged, carrying with him not just authority, but command. The captain had arrived, and with his arrival, the balance of the cabin was about to change. The cabin had fallen into an uneasy quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but suffocates. Every passenger knew something was unfolding, something uncomfortable, something ugly. Yet most chose stillness, as if by shrinking back into their seats, they could make themselves invisible. Phones appeared, lifted just high enough to capture the scene. A red recording light blinked from one row. Another passenger angled his device discreetly against the seat in front of him. They weren't rescuers. They weren't challengers. They were observers, documenting, but never stepping in. The pilot sat rigid, his form a shield, his composure a fragile wall against the rising tide of humiliation. The flight attendant lingered nearby, arms crossed, lips pressed tight in self-righteous confidence. Around them, the audience divided into two camps, those who stared openly and those who pretended not to. A middle-aged man cleared his throat, glanced at the pilot, then looked away quickly when the attendant's eyes darted in his direction. A young woman, her earbuds hanging loose around her neck, shifted uncomfortably and whispered to the person beside her, "This doesn't feel right." But neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke louder. And that was the cruelest part, the silence. The pilot could feel it pressing down on him, heavier than the flight attendant's accusations. No one rushing to his defense, no one willing to risk confrontation. Only sidelong glances, pitying eyes, and the quiet decision to let the storm rage without interference. Still, not everyone looked away. 2 rows ahead, an elderly woman turned slightly in her seat, her gaze steady, soft, and deliberate. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But in her eyes, there was something different. Recognition. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if to say, "I see you. I believe you." Across the aisle, a teenager clutched his phone but kept lowering it, too conflicted to record. He met the pilot's eyes for a brief second, then quickly dropped his gaze, ashamed of his own hesitation. Supportive glances, quiet acknowledgement, but nothing more. And that isolation grew like a shadow, stretching over him, whispering in the spaces between heartbeats. "You are alone in this fight." The flight attendant's voice broke the silence again, sharper this time, meant for the whole cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll resolve this shortly. Please remain patient while we verify this passenger's claim." Her phrasing sliced deeper than the words themselves. This passenger's claim, stripped of his title, his service, his years of dedication, reduced to someone who had to prove his right to exist where he sat. "The murmurs rose again. Some passengers frowned at the attendant's tone. Others avoided eye contact altogether, afraid of being pulled into the storm. The pilot inhaled slowly, grounding himself. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He wouldn't rise to anger. He wouldn't lash out. His silence now was louder than any outburst. But inside, the weight pressed harder. Every second dragged, each one amplifying the loneliness of sitting in a crowded cabin, yet feeling utterly abandoned. And then, something shifted. It was faint at first. A sound, distant but distinct. The metallic click of a door opening, the hush of movement from the cockpit. Footsteps, measured, heavy, approaching. The murmurs dwindled, phones lowered, eyes widened. The audience that had chosen silence now leaned forward in anticipation, the air thick with expectation. Something was about to change, and everyone knew it. The pilot straightened in his seat, his focus sharp. He recognized the sound before anyone else. He had heard those footsteps countless times before. Steady, confident, commanding. The captain was coming. And with each step closer, the silence in the cabin transformed from apathy to anticipation. The judgment the flight attendant had tried to pass would no longer stand uncontested. The stage was set. The audience waited, and the moment of truth was about to arrive. The cabin door clicked open, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the air seemed to shift. A man stepped through, broad-shouldered, steady, his presence commanding without needing to say a single word. His captain's uniform was sharp, his cap tucked neatly under his arm, and his expression unreadable. Every passenger who had stayed silent now leaned in, their eyes locked on him as though salvation, or judgment, had just walked down the aisle. The flight attendant's face lit up, smug, confidence tightening her features. To her, this was the moment her authority would be validated. She straightened, her voice louder than necessary. "Captain," she announced, gesturing toward the seated pilot, "we've had an issue here. This gentleman insists on occupying a first-class seat, but he hasn't been able to provide proper verification. I believed it best to bring it to your attention before things escalated further." There was a pause, the kind that seemed to stretch into eternity. The captain didn't answer right away. He scanned the faces around him, the passengers frozen in anticipation, the silent phones held low but still recording, the flight attendant standing tall in her assumed righteousness. Finally, his gaze settled on the young black pilot. The two men locked eyes. And then, the captain's voice broke the silence. Calm, even, yet laced with something unmistakable. Respect. "Is that true?" he asked, not in doubt, not in suspicion, but in a tone that carried the weight of recognition. The younger pilot's shoulders eased, if only slightly. He opened his mouth, but before he could answer, the captain continued. "You're telling me," he said slowly, turning back to the attendant, "that this officer, in full uniform, seated in first class, has to prove his right to sit here." The attendant stiffened, her smugness faltering for the first time. "Well, yes, Captain. I only wanted to ensure—" "Ensure what?" The captain's voice deepened, not raised but sharpened like a blade. "That a man who has logged more hours in training than most people spend behind a desk is questioned in front of an entire cabin. That he's treated like a fraud before anyone even asks his name." The words struck hard. Murmurs rippled through the rows of passengers, some nodding, others whispering. The attendant faltered, fumbling for an explanation. "I just thought—" "You thought wrong." The captain's reply was swift, cutting, final. And then he did something that silenced the murmurs altogether. He stepped closer to a younger pilot, his voice shifting from steel to warmth. "Lieutenant," he said, addressing him with the title he had earned, "I didn't expect to see you on this flight." The young pilot looked up, stunned. Recognition flickered across his face, then softened into relief. "Yes, sir," he replied quietly. "I had some leave time. Decided to head home for a few days." The captain nodded, almost smiling now. "Well, you've earned it, and I couldn't be prouder to have you aboard." The weight in the cabin shifted again, this time dramatically. The silence that had once been suffocating was now heavy with realization. Passengers who had doubted, who had stayed quiet, now exchanged guilty glances. Phones lowered, as if recording any longer would be shameful. The flight attendant's confidence drained completely. Her cheeks flushed red as the reality of the moment pressed down on her. She had not only mocked a pilot, she had mocked a brother in service, someone the captain himself clearly respected. But the captain wasn't finished. He turned his gaze back to her, voice steady but uncompromising. "First class isn't a privilege you dole out like favors. It's earned, it's granted, and in this case it's his by right. This man doesn't need to explain himself to you, or to anyone else here." The attendant lowered her eyes, her earlier bravado shattered. The young pilot sat straighter, not in arrogance, but in quiet dignity. The respect he had been denied moments earlier had just been restored, and magnified by the very man who commanded the flight. Passengers shifted again, but this time their glances carried something different. Not pity, not doubt, respect, and maybe even shame for their earlier silence. The cabin felt transformed. The judgmental whispers were gone. In their place lingered an awareness that they had witnessed something bigger than a seat dispute. They had in arrogance fall against dignity, prejudice crumble before truth. The captain placed a firm hand on the young pilot's shoulder, a gesture that said more than any speech could. "Enjoy your flight," he said softly. And then he turned back to the attendant, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We'll discuss this later." Her throat bobbed as she nodded, wordless. The captain straightened, his presence still commanding as he began making his way back toward the cockpit. Every step carried the weight of authority restored, justice enforced. The younger pilot exhaled slowly, his chest lighter now. For the first time since the confrontation began, the isolation had lifted. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because though the captain had spoken, the ripple effect of his defense was only beginning to spread. And soon, the consequences would reach far beyond this single flight. The cabin was still buzzing from the captain's defense, but what came next would silence it completely. He stopped mid-aisle, turned back toward the passengers, and spoke in a voice that carried effortlessly through the cabin. "Since everyone seems so invested in this seat," he said, his tone steady but edged with authority, "let me make something absolutely clear." The murmurs died instantly. Dozens of eyes followed him, anticipation thick in the air. The flight attendant stiffened, her chin raised as though she still expected to be validated. The captain's gaze swept the rows, then landed firmly on the young black pilot. His words struck like lightning. "This man isn't just a passenger in uniform. He's not here pretending. He is my co-pilot for this flight." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Every whispered judgment, every raised brow, every quiet smirk, gone. Replaced by a collective gasp, then an almost tangible weight of shame that pressed down on the doubters. The attendant's mouth opened, then closed again, as if words had abandoned her. The smugness she carried earlier drained completely, replaced by a flush of red creeping up her neck. She staggered a step back. Kay, clutching her tablet to her chest like a shield. Passengers who had pulled out phones lowered them slowly, unsure whether to keep recording or hide the evidence of their silent complicity. A few exchanged guilty glances, their eyes darting away from the pilot they had quietly judged only moments earlier. One older man in business attire leaned back in his seat, muttering under his breath, "My God, we all assumed." A young woman across the aisle, her expression softening, whispered, "He's the co-pilot?" Her words carried a mix of awe and regret, heard by more than just her row. The captain wasn't finished. He stepped closer to the flight attendant, his eyes never wavering. "You didn't just question his ticket. You questioned his right to sit in the very cabin he helps operate. You mocked a man who has earned every stripe on that uniform." The attendant's lips trembled. I didn't realize, Captain. I thought—" "That was the problem," he cut in sharply. "You thought instead of asking. You assumed instead of respecting." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. The weight of the truth wasn't just on the attendant. It hung over the entire cabin. The young pilot, still seated, didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't even look at the attendant who had mocked him. His calm, dignified expression told the story. He had endured worse, and yet here he sat, not broken, but stronger. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The man once treated as an intruder was now recognized as one of the leaders of the flight itself. The attendant, once standing tall in her authority, now stood exposed in her arrogance. A ripple of quiet admiration began to replace the shame in the cabin. A middle-aged passenger offered the pilot a nod, a silent gesture of respect. Another smiled faintly, as though trying to atone for earlier doubt. The captain plussed, laid a firm hand on his co-pilot's shoulder. "You've got nothing to prove here," he said softly, but loud enough for all to hear. The words weren't just reassurance. They were a reminder, to everyone, that dignity doesn't beg for validation. It stands tall even when mocked, and it's the truth that eventually forces the world to fall silent. The young pilot nodded once. "Thank you, sir." His voice was calm, steady, but beneath it was a quiet strength that resonated through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, guilt mixing with admiration. They had judged too quickly. And now, in the span of a few sentences, they realized they had witnessed not humiliation for him, but humiliation for their own assumptions. The captain glanced once more around the cabin. His eyes lingered briefly on the passengers holding phones, as if daring them to consider what their recordings now truly captured. Not scandal, but shame. He turned, his presence still commanding, and moved back toward the cockpit. The message was clear. The conversation was over. But for the passengers, the lesson had just begun. Because in that moment, every person aboard understood. Respect is not given by appearance. It is earned through sacrifice, discipline, and character, qualities that no seat assignment can measure. The young pilot sat in silence, his composure unshaken. Around him, passengers who had doubted him now couldn't stop glancing his way, their expressions shifting from judgment to admiration. And for the flight attendant, there was no escape from the humiliation she had brought upon herself. The cabin had witnessed the truth. And once truth is revealed, it cannot be undone. The silence after the revelation was heavy, almost sacred. Every passenger felt it, the weight of truth settling into the cabin like a storm that had finally broken. And then the captain's voice, calm but commanding, cut through the stillness once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his gaze sweeping the rows, "respect is not about appearance. Says, it is not about wealth, privilege, or skin color. Respect is about what a person has earned, what they have sacrificed, and the dignity with which they carry themselves." The words echoed, lingering in the space between passengers who only minutes before had whispered judgments. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces flushed with guilt. Others nodded slowly, as if the captain had given voice to a lesson they had long forgotten. The flight attendant, who only moments earlier had mocked with such arrogance, now stood trembling. Her earlier confidence was gone, replaced by the unmistakable sting of shame. Her eyes darted around the cabin, as if searching for an ally, but there were none left. The captain's tone hardened. "Step aside," he ordered, his voice quiet but unyielding. "You've done enough." The attendant swallowed hard, her cheeks red, her hands tightening on the edge of her tablet. For a moment it looked as though she might argue, but faced with the unwavering authority of her captain and the silent judgment of an entire cabin, she slowly stepped back, retreating toward the galley. And then, something remarkable happened. A passenger began to clap. Just one at first, a steady, deliberate rhythm. Then another joined, and another, until the sound swelled, echoing through the cabin. Applause filled the air, not for spectacle, but for justice. The young pilot sat still, his composure unshaken, but his eyes glistened faintly as he looked around at the faces that had once doubted him, now transformed by the weight of truth. A few passengers leaned toward him, offering quiet words of gratitude. "Thank you for your service," one man murmured. "You handled that with such grace," whispered a woman across the aisle. The pilot nodded politely, his voice soft but steady. "I just did what I was trained to do. Stay calm, stay focused. No matter turbulence." His words weren't just about flying, they were about life, the storms of prejudice, the turbulence of judgment, the trials faced quietly and with dignity.